Well, having hooked himself to heroin, the addict will get the most terrible illness if he tries to stop taking it. That's the doctrine, and it's pharmacological nonsense. The withdrawal symptoms from opiates are not severe and never dangerous, though, of course, they do exist. Insofar as they are genuinely feared, it is because there has been a campaign of exaggeration about them for nearly 200 years. There is decisive evidence that the suffering of withdrawal, such as it is largely of psychological origin, and the psychology originates with lies and misunderstandings. Moreover, it is a matter of common clinical observation that addicts exaggerate their symptoms for their own obvious ends, namely to induce doctors to prescribe. Well, what about crime and addiction? Is it not the case that addicts, in the words of one British liberal commentator who advocated free heroin for everyone who wanted it, that they have to rob and steal to maintain their habit? Insofar as there is a causative relationship between addiction and crime, it is that a disposition towards criminality causes addiction, and not addiction that causes criminality. Of 100 addicts, for example, whom I interviewed on their entry into the prison in which I worked in England, 67 had been to prison before they ever took heroin. When you consider that in order nowadays to get into prison in Britain, you have to be convicted about 10 times. And furthermore, that to be convicted once, you have to commit between 5 and 20 crimes, at least if you're an averagely competent British criminal pursued by an averagely incompetent British police force. It follows that of 100 addicts, 67 had committed between 50 and 200 crimes before they took heroin the first time. The other 33 had probably not been caught. I actually asked them the wrong questions. But in any case, my findings are not new. These are old findings. The career, if that is what it was, of the writer William Burroughs illustrates this perfectly. Burroughs was a natural-born criminal who happened to come from a privileged background. He went to Harvard, but according to his own account, nothing in Western or indeed in any other civilization interested him as much as the life of crime. He spent his time on leaving Harvard, for a time anyway, going through the pockets and stealing the small change of drunks on the New York subway system, and that's before he ever took heroin, which I think you will agree is not the sign of a refined moral sensibility. And though he despised his family and their money, they both came in rather handy to get him out of prison in Mexico after he murdered his wife there, a crime that had nothing whatever to do with the consumption of heroin. Burroughs' first book, Junk, subsequently republished as Junkie, is unconsciously revealing and instructive. Burroughs tells us that the addicts with whom he associated called doctors who prescribed the drugs they demanded, they called them writing croakers, not a term either of respect or affection, but one of contempt for their naivety or for their dishonesty. He also tells us that his own withdrawal symptoms, described in lurid terms, were relieved by antihistamines, which is confirmation that they were largely of psychological origin, since there's no pharmacological reason why antihistamines, other than by their mildly tranquilizing effect, should have relieved them. Well, what of the need of medical assistance for addicts to cease taking heroin? Let me preface my remark by quoting a philosophical principle which I think comes from Aristotle, though I may be mistaken in this and I'm open to correction. And this principle is that whatever happens must be possible. And the fact is that millions of opiate addicts have given up their habit without medical assistance. I'm not an admirer, to put it mildly, of Mao Zedong, but he was without question the greatest therapist of opiate addicts in the history of the world, and he's the greatest therapist the world will ever see. When he came to power, he told 20 million or so opium smokers in his own inimitable fashion that if they didn't give up, it would be the worse for them. And lo and behold, they did give up. No other treatment was necessary. Now, it clearly wouldn't have made much sense for Mao similarly to have threatened consumptives with the similar treatment if they didn't stop coughing up blood. And this suggests to me, at least, that there is a difference, a conceptual difference, between a real illness like tuberculosis and what is fundamentally self-infliction, albeit one with medical consequences. Incidentally, many thousands of American servicemen addicted themselves to heroin in Vietnam, but 2 years after their repatriation, their rate of addiction was no greater than that of draftees who would go to Vietnam but never did go because the war had ended. So why, ladies and gentlemen, have these most obvious and salient facts been overlooked, and their significance also? They're to be found in all the textbooks. In the first place, to overlook them is in the interests, at least in the short-term interests, of those addicts themselves who wish for a rationalization of their decision to continue taking drugs and to be regarded as ill or victims rather than as having made bad choices. It is also in the interest of a small but significant group of people who have devoted their lives and careers to the so-called care of drug addicts, and who in effect need the addicts far more than the addicts need them. These people need to see their wards as victims, not as agents. And they also accept the modern prejudice that in order for someone to display any sympathy, understanding, and compassion for someone in an unfortunate situation, it is necessary to accept uncritically that man's account of his own sufferings. But in my view, there's a deeper historical reason why such obvious truths about the subject should have prevailed, and that is that they are embodied in a powerful and unbroken literary tradition dating back to the English Romantics of the early 19th century, particularly, of course, De Quincey and Coleridge. Now, Coleridge, of course, wrote in a self-dramatizing prose style in which it's quite impossible to tell the truth about anything. In any case, he was a most frightful liar about his conduct and was frequently scheming and dishonorable. But it was more especially De Quincey's famous book, The Confessions of an English Opium Eater, that started the whole downward spiral into preposterous obfuscation, evasion, self-pity, and implicit self-glorification. The literary tradition has been unbroken ever since. When Edgar Allan Poe and Charles Dickens wrote about opium dreams, they lifted their symbolism straight out of De Quincey. Baudelaire, of course, translated De Quincey and inaugurated a long French literary tradition of claptrap about opiates. De Quincey had his American imitators also, who repeated what he wrote more or less faithfully. And the dramatization of what in effect was a sordid little personal habit has continued ever since, uninterrupted and repeated in novel and film, from Cocteau and Aleister Crowley to Nelson Algren, you probably remember the man with a golden arm, and Irving Walsh of Trainspotting. It was De Quincey who started the search for the buried psychological treasure that explained and, of course, justified opium addiction, and first invested it with special transcendent intellectual and emotional effects, claiming that it opened up to people realms that non-takers of opium could not imagine, and also claiming that only those with experience of opium had the right to speak about it. He claimed, in fact, to be the Pope of the Church of Opium. Addicts to this day claim that they are the only people qualified to speak of the seriousness of withdrawal effects, as if only people with cerebral malaria or bowel cancer could speak of their seriousness. Opium, says De Quincey, introduces among mental faculties the most exquisite order, legislation, and harmony, though he gives no concrete example of this exquisite order, legislation, and harmony.